Watching the horrors of the First World War, Sigmund Freud commented that death will no longer be denied. During the First World War, 210,000 Irish men and some women fought for the British, in the British Army, for the Canadians, for the Australians, in that conflict. When you contrast that with the 1,600 who fought in the 1916 Rising, you see that there was a major discrepancy there. It is estimated that 25,000 of those Irish who fought lost their lives in the First World War. So, in terms of Irish involvement in military conflicts, the Irish involvement in the First World War dwarfs all of those other rebellions put together. Even the War of Independence was fought with 3,000 machine guns and rifles. So, even though there were so many Irish who fought in the First World War, what's extraordinary is that in the decades afterwards, their contribution, their sacrifice was forgotten. It was written out of the history. Because the Ireland that the survivors returned home to in 1918 had changed. Ireland no longer wanted home rule, it wanted full independence. And a certain shame was attached to those who had gone off to fight for the British Army. They had been on the wrong side. 1916 had changed everything. But in recent decades, research has been done on the Irish who served in this conflict, the stories of heroism, the stories of despair, the accounts of the horrors of the war. And people have come to terms with this part of Irish history, so that this should also be recognised as an important part of the Irish historical memory. So much so that President Mary McAleese in 1998 joined with Queen Elizabeth II of Great Britain to unveil a memorial to the Irish dead who had served in this conflict. A peace tower was erected at Messines, near Flanders, where so many of the Irish had died. And it was unveiled on the 11th of November 1998, so for the 80th anniversary of the ending of the war. And that was also important as well, because it was the coming together of an Irish president with the British monarch, coming together in a show of unity and support, recognising a chapter of Irish history that for so long had been unfairly neglected, which had been deliberately erased from the memory. You had some people like Tom Kettle, the Home Rule MP, who actually was in Belgium trying to buy arms illegally to smuggle into Ireland when the war broke out in 1914. And he went off, served, even though he was in his 40s, and he died. He was killed in the Somme. And in a way, the tragedy of the First World War is that the European powers hadn't learned from the horrors of the American Civil War. They hadn't learned that technology, machine guns and so on, had actually changed how wars would be fought. The way the American Civil War in its final months had degenerated into trench warfare. Well, they hadn't learned the lesson. They all thought the war would be over by Christmas. And so, foolishly, began fighting the war using the exact same strategies and tactics as they had tried in the 19th century, but finding that men would just be mowed down. If we look at the population of Ireland in this period, it was 4.4 million. So if you look at the 210,000 who volunteered to go over and fight, that is a significant figure. It's perhaps not as large as the number of volunteers in Britain, but it is nonetheless important. And the figure of 25,000 dead represented 7 out of every 1,000. So that was only a quarter of the German or the French casualties, but still a significant figure. You also see a kind of a partition in the way the Irish brigades, the Irish regiments were established, because 3 were established. You had the 10th Division, which was a kind of an all-Ireland brigade. You had the 36th Ulster Division, and that was created for the Ulster Volunteer Force. And then you had the 16th Irish Division, and the idea is that that would be created out of the Irish Volunteers, the Irish Parliamentary Party, and that would be a kind of a nationalist brigade to go with the Unionist brigade, which was the 36th. But there was a discrimination in the way that those divisions were treated, because the British trusted the Ulster Volunteers. Even though they had been planning effectively a rebellion in 1914, they trusted them, so they gave them their own officers. They allowed Ulster Volunteer leaders to be the officers in the area. They did not trust the Irish Volunteer Division. They insisted that they would have British officers. They tried to send them to places where their loyalty could be tested. They wanted them to be examined. So you see a real difference there, and that created a real bitterness amongst them. It alienated John Redmond, the leader of the Parliamentary Party, because he saw that the Irish nationalists were being treated differently in the conflict. What those divisions had in common, though, was the incredibly high rate of casualties. They fought at Gallipoli, they fought at the Somme, they fought at Messines, and so the blood that was shed in Europe, it wasn't nationalist blood, it wasn't loyalist blood, it was Irish blood for a cause which, well, they were united in believing in. It's interesting to go back to the outbreak of the war. First of all, you had the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand on the 28th of June 1914. This was right in the middle of the negotiations to try and resolve the Home Rule crisis. Just a week earlier, the King had called the Buckingham Palace Conference to try and bring the warring parties together. Austria gave an ultimatum to Serbia because their Archduke had been assassinated there. The interlocking mechanisms of the various alliances kicked in, and so the countries went to war. But right as all of this was happening, on the 26th of July, the Irish Volunteers smuggled guns into Ireland. They smuggled guns into Dublin, into Howth, and it was only a handful of guns, about 1,500 rifles. So a fraction of the numbers that the Ulster Volunteers had been able to smuggle in. And many of the guns, in truth, were a little obsolete. Although that said, they would be used later in the 1916 Rising. But there you see the police did try to intercept the gun running, and they were unsuccessful, and the nationalists began jeering the police on the streets of Dublin. And at Bachelor's Walk on the River Liffey, the police retaliated. They opened fire, wounding 50 and killing 4 people. And again, that showed a double standard. The Ulster Volunteers were able to smuggle guns in. No one said anything. The Irish did it. They were attacked. They were killed. They were wounded. For Ireland, though, the outbreak of the war meant peace. It meant that the Home Rule crisis was postponed and Ireland united for that period. And the crowds of the volunteers who went off, the groups of the volunteers who went off to fight, were cheered by crowds along the streets. They were jeered when they returned home in 1918, but they were cheered as they left. And again, everyone believed that the war would be over by Christmas, and everyone believed that there was a good principle at stake. Catholic Belgium had been invaded by Germany, and that this was a cause worth fighting for. The Germans were plundering in Belgium, that this was an attack on a good neutral country. Redmond gave his famous speech at Wooden Bridge where he said, "To the best of our ability, we should go wherever the firing line extends, in defence of right, of freedom and of religion in this war. It would be a disgrace forever to our country to do otherwise." The question, though, we have to ask is, why did so many Irish go? What inspired them to go and join the British Army and fight over in the continent? And there are so many reasons. Some, a small number, did it for economic reasons. Some did it because they believed Redmond. They trusted him. They knew that Home Rule was coming, and that this was a way of showing their allegiance, their loyalty to the British government, to show that they could be relied upon, that they deserved their independence. They would fight in this war, win this war, and then the government would reward them for that loyalty by giving them their Home Rule. So some did it because of that political idealism. Some did it because of a different kind of idealism. An idealism that said this is a good struggle. We are on the side of right, the others are on the side of wrong. We should do this. But others got swept away by the propaganda. Some got swept away because their friends were joining up. Some got swept away because the people in their clubs and societies were going, and the camaraderie of it. People now looking back on it say that a kind of a war hysteria afflicted countries in this period, afflicted the youth in Britain and the youth in Ireland, where for so many complex psychological and personal reasons, people wanted to go and serve, and they didn't want to stay at home while their friends and comrades went and fought. But as the horrors of war became more apparent, as the casualties and the Irish casualties mounted at Gallipoli and at the Somme, then people began to have a different view. So by the end of the war, when conscription was introduced in Britain, conscription was rigorously rejected in Ireland. The Home Rule Party fought against it. Sinn Féin fought against it. This idea that Irish men would be forced to go and fight in the conflict. Well, Irish people would not do that. During the time a movie was made in America on the life of Robert Emmet, and when it was screened in cinemas, well, first of all, the British government tried to postpone it being shown in Irish cinemas because they thought it would disrupt the plans for conscription. And when it was finally released, there were shouts at the end of no conscription, up Robert Emmet. And the government was never able to introduce conscription in Ireland. The Irish people by that point were not prepared to go and fight for a cause they no longer believed in, especially when the casualties were so high, when the fighting was so brutal. The American novelist Edith Wharton asked W.B. Yeats during the war to contribute to an anthology of war poetry, and he refused. He didn't want to do anything that could be seen to be glorifying the conflict. However, he did at the same time write a poem which reflected on the conflict. It was a profound meditation on enlistment, and it was entitled An Irish Airman Foresees His Death. I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above. Those that I fight, I do not hate. Those that I guard, I do not love. Nor law, nor duty bade me fight, nor public men, nor cheering crowds. A lonely impulse of delight drove through this tumult in the clouds. I balanced all, brought all to mind. The years to come seemed waste of breath. A waste of breath the years behind. In balance with this life, this death.